This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about reading like a writer, and we all brought our current read, so we'll do a little bit of what we're reading now, why we like it, and also what we're taking out of it as writers. So I brought A Man Called Uwe by Fredrik Backman. This is my latest read. What do you guys have?
Very close to finishing a book called Feedback by an Australian author, actually, Peter Cordran. And he's a well-known, successful sci-fi writer.
Nice.
It's a first contact story, actually. And yeah, unusual one.
Okay, cool. What's yours, Kathryn?
Cool. So I just started last night Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and I always challenge myself. I challenge myself to pick something off of my library's recommendations about once a month, and that was my challenge for this month. So it's a little outside of my norm, but I'm really enjoying it. But previous to that, I had just finished rereading 12 books by Patricia Briggs in her Mercy Thompson series. So I'm kind of spanning the gap there.
Nice. She just rattles that off. Yeah, previously.
I know, 12 books.
Yeah.
They're fast.
That was Monday.
What was that, 12 days of reading?
Maybe 11 or 10.
Oh, holy cow, Kathryn. Putting me to shame, good Lord.
They're urban fantasy adventure romps, and they're very quick reads, and they're also very well done. So they're fun and fast to read, and I've been rereading them, so I already kind of know what's going on. But yes, so I'm spanning the gap between two books. Just started Where the Crawdads Sing and just finished a bunch of urban fantasy.
Oh, okay. How far into Where the Crawdads Sing are you?
About a quarter of the way.
Oh, well, that's respectable. Yeah, that's enough. I was like, if you're 10 pages in, how much can you talk about? But
it's definitely well beyond my put down moment anyway, that's for sure.
Right.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it, I am.
And the rate of speed at which you read, I thought you might say, oh, day one, I'm 3/4 of the way through. So.
I might have been if I'd stayed up last night, but I didn't, so.
So do you always read like a writer? Are you one of those writers who says, now I can't read for pleasure, or do you get to like shift gears and just read for enjoyment?
Yeah, I mostly read for enjoyment, but I know that I'm keeping half an eye, a mind. I don't know what it is. There's something that tracks because it's that old Stephen King quote. If you can't be a reader, it's very hard to be a writer. It's not. I don't think that's necessarily absolute. But it is true that I think the more and I've been a prolific, a whale reader, as they call them, ever since I was tiny, and ever since I could read, I was stealing books from, my dad's pile next to the bed. So I grew up on a lot of very adult science fiction. So for me, it's an escape. For one, definitely for when I want to be transported somewhere. And because that's my motivation, sometimes I get lost in it and then forget that, that was great what they did there. How did they do that? So I really liked, for a year I did a podcast with Brian Cohen focusing on young adult books, and we split the show into two parts, what we got from the book as a reader and what we got from the book as a writer. And so we read a book a week, a YA book a week, and then commented on it with specifics around, turning points, midpoints, character-driven, where we felt the plot was, what worked, what didn't work. And some of these were pretty major books as well, Hunger Games, Divergent, Red Rising. There were a lot. And so it was wonderful stumbling across all these different books. And it was really hard to read a book in a week, especially one that you'd started enjoying. And so sometimes I'd have to come back to it and say, I think now that was brilliant in the middle there, but what did they do? Because when it really grabs you, it's tricky.
Right.
So, however, on the other end of it, when we posed this topic, what occurred to me is I will get tripped up by prose. So when the story development is beautiful, I don't notice it. When things occur that are jarring, whether it's prose or whether it's something a character does which is just silly, or whether it jumps the shark, or whether there's a Deus Ex Machina, then those I really pick up. As an author, I pick those up straight away, because how can you not? Having read your own work for holes, then it's pretty glaringly obvious. And some things I've come to hate. I'd started reading something from an extremely successful thriller author, an indie. I won't call them out. And it was full of so much head hopping inside a scene that it wasn't even omniscient. It was just, it drove me nuts. I couldn't
sloppy.
continue. But there's obviously something in those stories that are appealing to people. So I do understand that some of it is personal taste. So I'm wary of being a snob.
Well, I mean, head hopping is a flaw. It's a mistake of craft.
I'm surprised.
You can be objective and say that.
Because this was a book that was not a first book. This was, we're talking more than 10. So that was interesting. And then the current one I'm reading has got an interesting structure to it. So I won't talk about that right now because I'm taking up all the airtime. But yeah, I do have to force myself to read like a writer, and I have done it in the past as a very specific discipline, and that was really, really, really helpful. So I think if you can put a frame around it and say, I'm reading this work because there's something I want to learn from it, like I did with the thriller book, I picked it up specifically because I was curious as to what was hooking people. And then I was shocked that it didn't hook me because I expected it to. And it was the same actually when I picked up Divergent. I was really excited to read some new sci-fi, and I was bitterly disappointed because I thought this is like 50 Shades of Grey only written without the sex.
Oh, no.
If you take the sex out of 50 Shades of Grey, there isn't anything. So sorry, Veronica Roth. It's not a personal attack. Anyway, that's it. I'm shutting up now.
Okay. Well, I'll go next. I read for pleasure. I definitely, if it's good, I get lost in it. And I actually was getting lost in A Man Called Uva, which is told in the present tense. And I'm not sure how far into it I was. I mean, not a ton, but, far enough that all of a sudden I went, wait, are these verbs in the past tense? And so I looked at the page and I was like, oh yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And then I flipped back. I was like, yeah, he's switching. So he does in the now story, the chapters are in the present tense when he gives you backstory when we go back in time, but their whole chapters, he switches to the past tense, and it's so well done that I didn't notice it until all of a sudden my brain went like, wait, that was a past tense verb. I was like, what? So I do like you, Robert. I read for pleasure, but part of my brain is tracking stuff, sometimes with leg.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what did I just read?
Yeah.
Same experience with that book. I was reading it and I thought, hang on a minute. This was present tense a moment ago.
Right.
And so obviously we've got tracking calibration skills that a reader possibly wouldn't pick up. And so when you think about the unconscious experience of the reader, that's fantastic because we've only barely been able to pick it up because we were all transported and that's something caught me there. Because you're not necessarily reading it as a pain, like you haven't been given it as an editor's job, right? In which case you would pick that up straight away.
Right.
You're reading for pleasure, maybe at night time, whatever, and then you flip back a few pages. I gave that book to everybody I know. I think it's just it's gorgeous.
It is gorgeous. It is, yeah. And it was my sick day last week, so I read it on the couch. Basically the whole day. I did nothing but read this book on my sick day. So
there you go.
Yeah, it was
wrong with that.
That good. No, I mean that's high praise because I don't spend a lot of time pleasure reading because I spend so much time reading research for my work and then reading manuscripts for my work. And so to spend like 10 hours with the book in a single day, it was good.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Kathryn?
I'm glad you can read for pleasure, Alida, because as an editor, I imagine that could be kind of hard to turn that brain off. So yay.
Yeah, I know. It makes me happy too.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
I primarily read for pleasure, but I guess we're all kind of the same. I track stuff that I find either really, really good or really, really bad, right? Oh, wow, that was excruciatingly hard for me to read. Or, oh my gosh, now I want to know how she did that. And that's why I reread the Patricia Briggs series, is actually because I've been really interested in how she hooks from like the first sentence with incredible, like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen next? But then the inciting incident is very clearly an inciting incident later, but you almost feel like that first sentence is the inciting incident. That's how fast it starts. Yeah. But just really well done in terms of the plotting. And so I've been kind of trying to dig back into that. But so a lot of the times it's like backfilling the writer part, right? So I'll read it and then I'll go, wait, I need to go read that again, or I need to read that section again because something in there was so artfully done, and I want to experience it a different way than just as reading for pleasure. And I read so fast that I have to go back and reread in order to get anything else out of it. Otherwise, it's just like, oh, that was good. Next. And on to the next.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I'm glad you go back and reread for the writer's mind.
Yes. I need it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love those beautiful sentences where you like have to stop and take a breath and then reread them. I just read, I don't have it here in this room at the desk, unfortunately, but I just read Sinclair Lewis's book, Ann Vickers. I'm reading that right now as well. And there's just this beautiful metaphor of this pair of shoes that was like some woman in town, and it was red and brave on top and, worn and trashy. I forget what words he used on the bottom, but the upper leather and then the sole of the shoe being compared to this person in the top and the bottom. And it caught me by such surprise that I laughed out loud. Yeah. I was not expecting that kind of raunchy little metaphor in this book from the 1930s, and such great word choice. But anyway, speaking of going back. So, what have you learned from your read du jour? Speaking of reading like writers?
As I said, I'm right on the end of this. And it's interesting because it's a dual timeline, told partially, well, actually not partially, I mean, 50% of it is flashback. And as I get into the end, the flashback's been interesting, but I don't know what it's serving. And I think as an editor, I would have said, I don't know that you need all that in there. It's a good read. I'm not, it's no criticism specifically. It's my reaction to Peter's story. So I was wondering, what it is. And right at the end, so maybe there's something that's going to tie up in there. I mean, it is a time loop story. So it's odd science fiction because what I'm noticing here is that this is a little bit of a genre mashup in subgenre mashup in the sense that there's time travel, there's time loop, there's what do you call it? Destiny. Anyway, when things are you can't change them.
Predestined.
So there's that, and then there's alien contact, and then right at the end of the book, we've gone into kind of almost galactic exploration and mind melding with aliens. So it's
wow.
It's interesting to see. I feel like the end part of the story it doesn't feel like it's bolted on, but it's an extension of a character, but it's completely different.
Mm-hmm.
It's still sci-fi though, so it's making me wonder about whether all that stuff at the start with the backstory whether so much of it needed to be there to establish the time loop, and I just don't think it did.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's a wartime. Is it wartime? I don't know what it is. I can't remember. But yeah, it's setting conflict in Korea. So there's plenty of blood and guts and action. So it grabs you. So it's a good story in that sense. But it had me, as a writer, it had me wondering, why is that there? What is that serving? What purpose is that serving other than just popcorn entertainment and establishing this character? It didn't need half the book to do that.
Right. So do you have a theory about why it's included? I mean, this is traditionally published, right? So presumably agented and edited and...
Actually, I don't know whether this one is or not. I don't know. Anyway, it comes across as extremely well edited, so I wouldn't say that it's this is it's indistinguishable from a trad pub.
Okay.
I would have read plenty of trad pubs where I would have been concerned about the storyline. It's not a major flaw. I assume it's there because right at the end he wants to show the collision of these two timelines,
right.
And the sort of devastating emotional and personal impact it has, and that sort of doesn't quite come off, maybe because it's taken so long. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. How would I do it differently? I don't know, and so that's reasonable because clearly the story works.
Right.
Yeah. So some reflections as a writer, definitely while reading it, and I picked it up for pleasure. I wanted to read it because he's a known author, and he'd given them out for free during isolation as a gesture of generosity. I thought, I should read that.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. I wish you were all the way through the end so you could tell us how it tied up and if it was satisfying.
I'll come back to it.
I really wanted to know, did it pay off? Interesting. Do you want to go, Kathryn, or shall I?
Sure, I can go.
Okay.
So like I said, I'm only about a quarter of the way in for this Where the Crawdads Sing, but oh my gosh, talk about break my heart. I already know this book is going to break my heart, which makes me love it even more. I read the first, the prologue is future, and then you jump back in time and you follow the girl as she grows up. And I'm assuming my inciting incident is coming soon. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm probably right on the cusp of it. But it's they started with the bang of a body by the end of the first page, and then they drop you back 17 years or 18 years and just expect you to deal, right? And then you get hooked in with this little 6-year-old girl. My heart was like, oh no, there's a 6-year-old girl. And so just that power of that hook and the juxtaposition and getting my emotions as her mom walks down the road away from her on page 2, and you're like, I mean, I was in it, right? And then not to mention that it is beautiful. The prose is really pretty. Just very well woven together as you kind of get this bright, intelligent young girl with no formal education, growing up by herself, figuring stuff out, and I'm in it. And I'm not even to the point where her life has changed yet, right? And there's been a couple hints of the future, and you kind of know how something's gonna happen that has to do with this body. And I'm fascinated by the way that they're using those hints to continue to draw me through what is a very slow, progression of her upbringing, right? So instead of it just being about this girl surviving in the swamp, there's this tension of, I know somehow she's going to be wrapped into this murder somehow.
Right.
So,
wow, that's a great use of a prologue. Hi, Aria.
I know, like cameo.
Yay. Our fourth member.
That's right.
Yes. Wow. Well, now I completely forgot everything you said, Kathryn, because I'm looking at Aria.
No, it is. It's the way that the prologue works. I know she turned 2. Crazy.
That's amazing.
But the way that the prologue works, like you said, like that's something that you really have to think about if you're going to have a prologue. And so reading a prologue in the beginning of this book, I was like, okay, like how does this work? But it's cool that the author has chosen to weave it in a couple of chapters just throughout to remind you, nope, this is coming. Nope, this is coming.
Yeah.
You know, something else is happening that you have to be aware of in this girl's life. So.
And that's really clever where, you know, it's not a fast-paced story either, to be able to do that and keep it going. And one of the things that if a book is too slow for me, because I find it very, very hard if there's not enough. So when they are able to keep my attention and it feels slow, or not slow, but considered, then I might look at it more deeply as a writer while I'm reading. I think, why am I still continuing with this? Because there's been no flashbangs for a while, you know.
Yeah.
I don't mean that in a shallow way, but you know, there hasn't happened. Whereas there are plenty of books where I've been reading them and not much has happened because it's just filled with shoe leather. You know, it's just people going from place to place or having inane dialogue about what they're preparing for dinner, perhaps because the author feels like they need to show character. And I just, this is terrible. This is just driving me nuts,
yes.
You know? And you just want to fast forward to the action. And I just, So that's why I think I get drawn. I like, as you know, I like sharp dialogue. I like that banter, the interaction, the way that shows subtext. So I really notice it when that's not present, when people just have on-the-nose dialogue that drives me batty. And there's a lot of it about.
There is, yeah. And I would not keep reading a book like that if it wasn't holding me. I'd be done so quick.
Yeah, and the only problem these days is it gets expensive because you go through a lot of Kindles when you throw them at the wall.
Yes. Too bad Kathryn's on mute.
Yeah. Throwing things at the wall when they're electronic is not a good plan, Robert.
Not a good plan. No.
So what about you, Alida? Are you
so A Man Called Uva. It was interesting when I first started reading this. You're being introduced to this character who's defined as a curmudgeon. Open the dictionary to curmudgeon. There's a picture of Uva. And the narrative goes through this. I mean, it's Tuesday and he's oiling his wood countertops in the kitchen, and he is just grouchy and cranky and complaining about everything in the world and the neighbors and the mailboxes. And early on I thought, well, I am enjoying this, but why?
Why am I liking this guy?
Why? How amazing that Beckman got away with writing that narrative in such a way that it kept you engaged, it kept you interested. And of course, we do meet a second character. The neighbors, second and third character, come into the story fairly early, so you get some interaction. But I think one of the real brilliant aspects of this book is the way the story unfolds. And so you start to see past Uva's curmudgeonliness bit by bit, and as we go into the past tense chapters, into his backstory, and we learn more about him, we become more endeared to him, or he becomes more endeared to us, I guess. And the reveals are really well done. This is such a character-driven story, but, for example, mild spoiler, not a plot-driven story, but Uva's wife, he talks to her for a while, and then you learn she's dead. So at first you think he's just kind of thinking about her, complaining to her, and then you realize that's all in his head because she's dead. And then later on, you're informed that there was an accident, but you don't know what it was, so, but then like a neighbor goes into his kitchen and there are these wheel marks all over the floor and she's stunned. She's so stunned she's not moving, can't talk, because she just realized that the countertops have all been lowered. Everything is set up for a person in a wheelchair, and she had no idea. And we as readers had no idea. And nobody ever says the word wheelchair.
And you don't see one stacked anywhere or anything. It's so...
Yeah. Yeah, it's just the tire marks and then this countertop. And so the way this information is exposed in the story is so subtle and so smooth. And the way it's laid out, it does create tension, but it's all character driven. It's not what's going to happen next, but it is, I wonder what that means. I wonder why. And that's beautifully done. And then as you learn these things, you're just so moved by Uwe and his story.
That something had this curmudgeonly man so transfixed, and it's, his wife who represents a shadow side of him that you don't really understand until you read the entire book, in my opinion.
Right.
And yet it comes through in tiny little slivers in every chapter. It's lovely. It's so nice. And if you think about that from a representation of a human being, it's told from inside his head, and you feel very, it certainly seems very close to his head anyway. As you say, some of it's present tense, some of it's past, but you still, it's very third person direct, isn't it?
It is third person, and it's very close third. The narrative is definitely seeing the world through Uwe's perspective, but because Uwe is so emotionally closed off from the world, the emotional distance feels far, right? Yes. But that's just Uwe's natural state, is to be flat and shut down. But
he's an engineer, so he notices all these engineering type things and doesn't notice the people behind, the emotional. And it's really clever how that slowly plays out through the book, that he slowly, through the eyes of his wife, gets opened up to the way that his late wife. So I think it's remarkable. And the what was I going to say about the so a heavy-handed writer. We were talking about subtext in the previous episode. A heavy-handed writer would have had Uwe explaining in his head, but none of that happens ever. It's the only thing you get in his head is his observations and judgments about other as a curmudgeonly old man.
Yeah, and he is judgmental. Oh my goodness, right? But as you come to understand this man, you forgive his judgments. You see where they're coming from and what he means by them, and you see his softer side. The relationship with the next door neighbor is so wonderful, because as she keeps butting into his life, you get a couple of times where he hates her less. She says something clever, or she pokes fun at her husband, and then Uwe's reaction to that is so internal, so just confined and restricted, but he hates her a little less. And then you see this arc of them coming to really love each other, to really adore each other as neighbors almost. I mean, it's not really a father-daughter relationship, but her kids end up calling him grandpa because she doesn't have a parent in town. And so they're family. Whatever labels you want to put on it, they adopt him. And it's such a sweet transformation.
Yes, it's definitely had people in tears, that story. I think it's a good one.
It is.
And the movie's very good as well. they chose not to have the slow reveal of the fact that his wife is no longer with him. They just cut straight to that.
Okay.
So you actually see him laying flowers on the grave, I think, in the first few scenes. So, which I thought was a shame, because that was one of the things I really loved about it, the fact that he was so closed in,
right,
that he never revealed, as the narrator, he never even revealed. He was just, this was his way of life. He got up in the morning, he spoke to his wife.
Right.
He asked her for opinions about things, even though she was dead.
Right.
It's just very, very clever. Anyway, it's a translation too, isn't it?
It is. It's Swedish. It's set in Sweden. The author is Swedish, so.
And it's a debut.
Yeah, although he does have multiple other books out already. 2 in the back cover of this, but I think he's got 3 or 4 novels out now. And one of the other ones is already in a movie. Britt Marie was here, so. But yeah, I highly recommend this book. It was such a delight to read. And when is the last time I could say something like that? 2012, copyright, translation 2014. Oh, one thing that annoyed the heck out of me. One little thing. Kathryn's laughing. On mute if you're listening to this. Whenever somebody was angry, it says they hissed. And I hate that. That is one of my pet peeves, because hiss is an onomatopoeia. So unless the word can actually be hissed, it doesn't apply. And then it was overused. So I don't know if that was the author or just the translator. But by like the 10th time I read the word hissed, I was kind of pissed off. Pissed off. So, final thoughts on reading like a writer?
I think it's still worth, even though I know there are some writers who say, it's destroyed my love of reading. I think you can get past that. I think perhaps in the early stages that may be true, because you start to make comparisons perhaps to your own writing, and then that puts you off, or reverse, you read books and can't tolerate them because they've got mistakes that you've been pulled up on yourself. But I think you can get past that. I am much tougher about what I will read though now.
Right.
And so I think that's probably as a result of it. But that's not a bad thing. I think if you're always reading work that you enjoy and that leaves you with something, leaves you better off for reading it, then surely that has to improve at least some of the background abilities of you as a writer. Obviously, there's no substitute for actually writing, but the more front loading you have, the more chance you've got of understanding story intuitively.
Right. Absolutely. I think we can end on that. Well said. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.